to tell you what I'm going to tell you, I think that the point of my talk overall this morning is that the point of our lives is to find happiness by becoming effectively kind, to help others and thereby make ourselves and others less miserable. And that effective kindness comes from the effectiveness of our kindness comes from an honest wisdom about all different sorts of things, both practical things, all kinds of practical things. Just, you could say the meaning of the teaching that Buddha is omniscient is like there isn't anything that might not be useful in helping somebody else. So there's all kinds of things that it could be useful to know depending on whom you're working with at a certain point in time. Gelek Rimpoche apparently thought it was extremely important to understand American culture, which is unlike most other Tibetans in history. And it became extremely important to understand our psychology and culture because then his kindness toward us would become more effective. But then in addition to all those kinds of things, there's also wisdom about the basic nature of things, how these things exist in some fundamental sense. So these are to make our kindness effective, we need the wisdom about how things really exist. What are our delusions that are causing us suffering in a fundamental way? But also all kinds of practical knowledge about how people are and what we might be able to do in an effective way to work with them and help them. And one of the things that, I've been, as I'll explain here in a minute, mostly trained in Buddhism within the context of the Gelugpa tradition. One of the things that I like about the tradition is that it doesn't set these two kinds of wisdom against each other or have one of them supersede the other. In other words, it's not like everything else we know is stupid and useless because it's all part of a complete delusion, and that emptiness, knowing that, will cancel out everything else in the world. It's not like that. Tables are tables. Human beings are human beings. They're not human beings in maybe the way that we ordinarily think, because our sense of ourselves as human beings is mixed up with levels of delusion. But they are human beings. And so these two kinds of wisdom work together synergistically rather than one of them canceling out the other. So for many of you, clearly, Gelek Rimpoche was an embodiment of this kind of effective compassion and effective kindness. And sadly, I was invited to say something about him. I really can't say very much. I lived a couple hours away from Ann Arbor for many years, and yet I only just met him last year. At that time, he wasn't well, but he was extremely wonderfully warm to me and immediately friendly. And I would say that I do regret the brevity of my connection with him. And it occurs to me that this might have some kind of deep root in my own mind stream, because it's not the first time something like that happened. And the other time is the other time that I had a chance to make a connection with a great teacher and didn't was when I was studying with Jeffrey Hopkins as an undergraduate and a graduate student at the University of Virginia. And many of my classmates, and Jeffrey included as well, were students of Geshe Wangyal, who was teaching in New Jersey. He was still alive. He was a Kalmyk Mongol and a layman, like Gelek Rinpoche. And it seems that Geshe Wangyal established the first center for Tibetan Buddhism in the West, in New Jersey. And even though many of my classmates were students and he was still alive, I didn't go up there for a long time. And when I did, I made close connection with the people who were running the center, and I became very involved with them and began collaborating with them on projects. And they weren't Geshe Wangyal, because Geshe Wangyal had already passed away by the time I started becoming involved with the center. So I don't know what to say about that, except it kind of reminds me of this. I did, on the other hand, meet and work with many other Tibetan teachers from Gelek Rimpoche's generation, the generation, that was born in Tibet and then brought the Dharma to the West, who shared it with us. So that includes His Holiness the Dalai Lama, but I'll not talk about him today because that would be the whole talk. Instead, I'll just talk about a few other teachers that influenced me, and they were all like Gelek Rinpoche, originally educated at Drebung Monastery. The first of those that I wanted to mention was Gen Losang Gyatso. In the 1980s, when I went to India the first time, Geshe Losang Gyatso, whom everybody called Genla, or like the teacher, was the principal of the Buddhist School of Dialectics, as it was called in English. And in Tibetan, it was called Seni Lapta, which means the definition school, because it was all about memorizing the definitions of things and then arguing about them so as to train your mind in logic. That's what they were doing. And I went there in 1985, in part for the purpose of improving my spoken Tibetan so that I would be able to consult with teachers on the meaning of Buddhist philosophical texts that I was translating for my dissertation topic, which was the two truths, conventional truth and ultimate truth, in Tsongkhapa's tradition, the Gelugpa tradition. And I was quite determined, I wasn't casual about this, I was quite determined to understand this and to figure out how it worked and then eventually how to explain it. How can there be two different truths, two kinds of reality about how things exist? And if there could be, then how would they fit together, like puzzle pieces or what? I mean, there wasn't any way that I could picture this or I couldn't describe it to other people because I couldn't quite make sense of it myself. And I had the sense of determination to figure this out. And Genla invited me to live at the school and to study and debate with the young monks, all of whom beat me very easily, of course, and to take private lessons with him working on a text of my choice from the Gelugpa tradition on the two truths. So I was a pretty ragged-looking, semi-literate hippie, basically, and Genla and his whole community there welcomed me very warmly. They appreciated me, and they also teased me about my kind of obsessive focus on the two truths. So they started calling me Den Ni, which means the two truths in Tibetan, and that sort of became what everybody would refer to me. Later, Jeffrey Hopkins found out about that, and he still calls me this from time to time when he sees me, although nobody else does anymore. But Genla was a gentle person and also could be gruff in his manner. He was from a different part of Tibet and a different social class than Gelek Rinpoche. He was from a rough part of Tibet, a poor farming family, and he loved to tell long, complicated folk stories that somehow would interweave with his Dharma teachings. He would talk about the beauty of his country, quote unquote, his country being calm. This rugged, beautiful, wild country where people rode around on horses and apparently sometimes shot guns. I mean, it was in the east of Tibet, of course, but it had, from his description, a kind of a Wild West feel to how it was there growing up. And in trying to teach me the two truths, he said, well, if you want to know which potato to plant for next year and which one to eat right now, you don't want to ask a philosopher. You ask a farmer. And I thought, well, superficially that makes sense, but I'm not really sure how that illuminates my philosophically how to unpack that. And so I don't know. It became like a challenge for me. It's like it didn't illuminate my mind, but it's stuck in my mind. And I spent a long time trying to figure out exactly what he was trying to say and what that meant and didn't mean. Why do we even need philosophers, right, and so forth, if that's the case. And eventually I did figure it out. I wrote an article, and I called it Ask a Farmer, right? And I published an article that just sort of an unpacking of what he taught me. he lived about 150 feet away from the Dalai Lama's residence in Dharamsala, and that's where the school is, in the shadow of the temple there. And in the 1980s, His Holiness was reaching the conclusion that Shukden was a force for partisanship and division, and Genla, which I won't elaborate on, you can just do your own research, but it's Genla really strongly agreed with the Dalai Lama about this, and he became very outspoken on this issue. And in some way, which I don't know, and it's a very complicated and problematic mystery, this seems to have led to his being murdered in the very room where I'd been studying with him, along with two of his students in 1997, 12 years after I met him. And the story of his life is really beautifully told in the book Memoirs of a Tibetan Lama, which is partly by Genla, but as told through Gareth Sparham. Around that same time in the 1980s, there was an assistant director of Tibet House. I see that Gelek Rimpoche was at one point the director of Tibet House in New Delhi. The assistant director in the 1980s was a teacher named Geshe Pelden Chakpa, who's now is still alive. It's based at in Mungad at Drebung Losaling there. And I went to live with him in New Delhi, and we formed a really close connection. He saw this determination I had to understand it at an intellectual level, the view of emptiness, and he never would answer my questions in a shallow or superficial way. It seems like he's like a much less mellow person. Is very intense and had the same kind of idea that it was really necessary to sharpen one's mind into a fine point, and to penetrate the view that was being described in the tradition. And he gave me a lot of critical clues to working out, what he taught me, a lot of it is behind, what I've written about emptiness since then. And then, so I felt very grateful to him immediately, and then he told me I had to do something, which is, that's what lamas will do sometimes, and you can't really say no. And he told me I had to go to Sarnath, which is a long train ride, and I didn't really want to go. But he said, you have to go there and get some books. And I was like, well, whatever, and it's so he gave me a list of books and a letter of introduction, and he sent me off to go and meet this guy that I didn't know named Geshe Tupke. And Geshe Tupke read the letter of introduction, and then he just let me sleep on the Tibetan rug next to his bed on the floor, and that's how I met Geshe Tupke. I gather he has a close connection with you guys here. And, over the years since then, I've had a lot more interactions with Geshe Tupke, and I've gotten a lot of different teachings from him, and, in some of the biggest translation project I worked on, he was a main scholar who helped us. He's really an incredible scholar, and at the same time, a wonderfully kind person. And one other thing that it might be a little harder to know is that he has a true spirit of renunciation as a monastic. Now, we know there's lots of monastics. Supposedly, it's said in the early 20th century, 25% of the adult male population in Tibet were in robes. And I think we could hazard a guess that not all of those people had a true spirit of renunciation. There's monks and then there's monks, right? And I'm not saying that Geshe Tupke is the only person who has this. I know that that's not true, but he is a person who has that in addition to these other qualities. And it's interesting to be around him. He doesn't ask for stuff, right? So therefore, there's no danger of him ever taking what is not freely given because he's not asking for anything. And it's You know, he's not going to ask you for food. He's not going to ask you for a raise. He's not going to ask you for anything, any money. He's not going to ask if he runs out of toilet paper. He's not going to ask you for toilet paper. So like that's something that's like really different, right, than what we're used to or what we take as normal around here. It seems really alien, and it's worth thinking about. You practice and you study and you study and you practice what you've learned, and then you teach it to others. And then another way of teaching them is to be kind and considerate, is to never ask them for anything and realize that their teacher is going to be doing without unless they generate in their minds this thought of consideration for the other person. Anyway, that's what I got out of them. So we've all been, you know, freely, generously given a lot of great gifts, this Dharma inheritance that, you know, we're working with. And in this human life, we only have a short time to absorb some of it and work with it, see how it opens up a way for us to be kinder and to become more effectively kind. And we know that part of our practice is to give to others as best we can in whatever way we can what we've received, to pass on the Dharma that we've understood. We all have different points of connection with the Dharma, and different kinds of strengths in terms, different ways of teaching and learning. And it's like, of course, right now everybody knows there's this complicated and exciting process of integrating the Dharma into our culture and trying to figure out, you know, how that's going to work. Everybody like having different ideas about it and thinking everybody else's ideas are terrible usually, right? And much of this is taking place now via extracting wisdom from the traditional culture, testing it with science, and then adapting it for our own purposes, which is a good thing, I think. But at the same time, we're always going to need centers that are dedicated to carrying on the Buddhist tradition per se as such, as like reference points to check whether the latest mindfulness fad has any grounding in ethics, and also, I think, as well springs for new inspiration and wisdom. Not just for Buddhists, I mean, but for everybody, yeah. So my basic idea, and as I've mentioned to the people who are in the living with loss thing, whatever, what's the proper word there? Weekend, okay, weekend. Is that the idea of Buddhism is that we suffer needlessly because we don't see things as they are. That's the core idea. And so that we can come to be free from needless suffering by questioning the way we ordinarily see the world, and challenging it and adjusting our understanding of what we see and how we're representing the world around us in our minds, so that it's more factually concordant, works with reality more smoothly. That's why I was making that reference earlier to the idea that everyone is apprenticed to the same teacher, reality, and we have to try to adjust ourselves to how things actually are. And so in the Buddhist tradition, the way to talk about the kinds of things that we're seeing wrongly and therefore needlessly suffering is that we tend to see ourselves and the things around us as being unchanging, having a kind of permanence, and that they don't have. When things are flowing more like rivers or flickering like flames, but they don't look like that, and so we just take it that they're not changing all the time when they are. And also that things seem to be like very concrete or unitary or substantial, the objects around us or the people, like I am a person, that is like one solid thing. But we've learned, through Western science to break down stuff into smaller parts. But actually, and so we think, well, maybe we really don't have this idea of stuff as concrete and solid anymore because we understand that everything is a system. Right, and there's all these different parts that are operating, but then there's still a problem because each of the parts in the system is still considered as a distinct whole. You say, yeah, there's not really a car there in and of itself because there's all these car parts, but So you take the part, and your mind does the same thing and say, oh, that's a spark plug. Just seems to be like a thing. But then if you're a spark plug expert, this is obviously not true because you can see all the different parts of the spark plug, none of which is a spark plug. And you see where this is going. I mean, you get down to molecules and atoms and protons and quarks, and it's like, what is the real thing that's there? You know, people say all of this is mostly space, right? And it's but then there's these little bits in the space, and that's what's really real. And then we just tell a story about it. Yeah, but I think the story about the bits is also a story, right? Because the bits are mostly space. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like you don't. The point being that when you think about things as how, even when we break things down into parts, we don't really get all the way to the back of our tendency to think that there's got to be something solid that's the foundation out of which everything in space and time, everything that extends in space and time, we feel like has to be built out of some fundamental building block. And this doesn't make any sense, because if the fundamental building block takes up any space and time, it's going to have parts itself because it extends. Right? Okay. So that's not the most important problem, although those are two really worthwhile things to think about. According to Tsongkhapa, you know, this system, the subtlest level of our misunderstanding is this idea that things exist, not that they exist permanently, although that's a problem, not that they exist in a kind of substantial way, although that's a problem. But the subtlest, deepest level of the problem behind all of that is the idea that things exist objectively from their own side. They say rang nerne druba in Tibetan, that is, that they're somehow established or set up from their own side. It doesn't have anything to do with me at all, that this is a table, right? That's just like, I play with the kids in school by, you know, writing a big letter on the blackboard, and then I go out and sit in the audience and I say, well, we're not doing anything here, we're all just passively receiving the message that's on the board, you know, of the letter A, right? And then it's like, but you know that isn't true, because there's no like objectively real A on the board. It's like we've just learned collaboratively how to go 1, 2, 3, A, and then forget that we did that and take it as though there's some real A out there on the side of the blackboard. Right? But that's, do you understand? It's like same thing with money. Though it's very easy to understand with money and letters, that these things are actually work and they're functioning and they're efficient, and yet they're established through a conventional collaboration. And it kind of doesn't make sense, because we think if they're real and they work, then they ought to be there, out there on the side of the thing. But those kinds of examples make it very clear that we can catch ourselves in the act of tricking ourselves into thinking that the letter A is on the board, and then noticing, I learned how to do that in kindergarten, and then pretended that I'm not doing it all the time and it's really out there. Yeah. So those examples are pretty easy to understand. And if you think about it like that, and you say, oh, well, yeah, tables are like that, chairs are like that, mountains are like that. And it gets like, oh, it's hard to understand that a mountain could be, you know, just imputed or ascribed to, you know, it's not like a mountain in itself. It's just like something that we designate or regard and, you know, learn to ascribe the identity of a mountain to. It doesn't seem the same as like with a dollar bill, right? I don't think it's really the same exactly. But this is what the tradition is exactly saying. And it's like, well, how can you get your mind around that? I think one way to do it is to think about all the different kinds of living beings that we know. And we know all of these things through science about like how different living beings, you know, see the world and how the world might, you know, we try to imagine how the world might appear if you had the sense faculties of a bat or, for example, or a spider or a dog. And I was thinking, yeah, well, of course, you know, spiders don't see mountains as mountains. It doesn't occur to them because they have these stupid spider brains or whatever, you know. And it's like, it's their bad karma to not know a mountain when they see it. They probably wouldn't know a dollar either, you know. It's like, but this is like, no, that doesn't make any sense. It's like, we're not talking about an impaired spider. We're not talking about a spider on LSD. We're talking about a regular, normal, healthy spider. And it sees a mountain exactly correctly. And there's no mountainness about it. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever, right? And it's like you can extend that example, and think about like how, if there's, spiders in this room, or yesterday there was a dog in the room, and it's like the dog was in the room, but like in a certain way, being in the same place at the same time as us, it was perceiving things that were actually there and legitimately, conventionally there from the dog's point of view, and legitimately, conventionally not there from our point of view, right? And how can that be? If things are actually objectively set up on their own side, how can there be like two like correct perspectives, one from which it's there and one from which it's not there, right? And then if you think about that, then that sort of gets you into this idea of like, oh yeah, a mountain is a mountain. The Gelukpa tradition is good with us saying that a mountain is a mountain. But like we have to remember that a mountain is a mountain from our point of view, correctly, as our point of view. But it's not like if you're a hungry ghost or something like that, or a dog or a spider or a bird. It's like also correctly not that, but something else, right? And that's what they're saying, is pointing us to that. And so, I mean, the traditional example is God's ghosts and humans go to the river and they all see something different. But we can just think about like all the different kinds of creatures we know that have all their sense faculties intact and yet correctly perceive something completely different where we do. And it's like, I think that's a way of undermining our sense that yes, chairs are chairs from our point of view correctly, but not objectively set up as chairs and tables on their own side. And of course, I'm not just talking about which language you're using, right? But the status of the object itself. So that's what I wanted to say about that. And I tried to do it without saying the word emptiness too much. Because and I mentioned this before, is like because I wrote a book on emptiness and I translated some things to do with emptiness, then a lot of times I talk about emptiness. And I find it like, first of all, it's not a good thing for everybody to focus their minds on. And second, when people try to focus their minds on it because they think, oh, this is the really important thing that I need to get here, it's like, oh, there's this other thing, emptiness, and I need to learn about it, and it's confusing and hard. And it's not productive because like we construct this like image of some new object, right? Another planet besides the ones that we know about, right? And then it's very mysterious and hard to understand. And that's not the way to approach it. You should what I think the way to approach it is to think about these things, like this stuff around us. Like how does the fire extinguisher, exist? What's its nature? It's like, just think about that. Like, what are the causes and conditions? What are the parts? What is the point of view that's necessary for us to correctly designate that as a fire extinguisher? Thinking about how things exist is like, rather than thinking about emptiness, is a much better way to think about emptiness, in my opinion. So don't think about it. Yeah. So as I said, I wanted, what's the point of all this is like I wanted to make the claim in the beginning that the worthwhile measure of spiritual growth is our effective kindness, our growth in becoming more kind and more effective in our kindness. That spiritual practice is not about special experiences or remarkable inner conditions that we could attain. We can get really good, warm feelings, like bliss, right? From singing, dancing, meditating, taking drugs, having sex. How do we know which ones of these are spiritual experiences or part of the path and which ones aren't, right? And how do you know? Do you see what I'm saying? It's like if you feel really great, if it helps you feel really great, What about, what about ecstasy, right? I don't think, I've never done anything like that. But apparently this makes you feel warm and loving towards everybody around. So is that a spiritual thing? So I think the answer is not how good it makes you feel, because lots of stuff makes us feel good, including some things in the Dharma, and also sometimes the Dharma makes us feel bad. So the difference is, I think, whether it facilitates or encourages or promotes, growth in kindness. Like that's the determinant. Does it help? Does our practice help us to become a kinder person? Like not from yesterday to today, but over the course of a year or two of persistence. Are we becoming softer and more open, more generous, more humble, more considerate, or not? And if we're not, then maybe that's not, it's like that's not really the practice for you. So to be effectively kind, aspiring to be able to be helpful to others, we want to know how to be helpful. So we have to keep learning stuff that we never thought would matter in a million years. Like we have to learn how to change diapers, and we have to learn maybe if you're on a board or something, that's going to be in charge of trying to keep the river from being polluted, then you might have to learn Robert's Rules of Order as a bodhisattva act. Do you see what I'm saying? Like there isn't anything that you can say that might not be like a necessary thing for us to learn as part of our practice in effective kindness. And that's why I was like saw the example of Gelek Rimpoche talking about this like intense dedication to trying to understand American mindset, right? Because like not something that Tsongkhapa studied, right? But it became relevant for the Bodhisattva at that particular time to know that, right? So Buddhists in this way, constantly bring up the word practice. We have a practice, we do a practice, what's your practice? This is like a very important thing in Buddhism, this idea of repetition, like weight training or conditioning, or doing repeated actions that become habits so that these habits become like our character or a second nature, transforming the mind through repeated exercises. And so you see that Rinpoche uses this word gom, and instead of saying a meditation class, he has gom. And gom, is usually translated as meditation. But then in Tibetan they always say gom means calm, like that meditation means familiarization. So that gom means to like develop a habit or familiarity with a certain kind of object, an intimacy with it. Through coming back over and over again. According to Jeffrey Hopkins, somebody once asked Jeffrey Hopkins why he was always talking about training in compassion. It's like, why don't you just be natural? Why don't you just, be yourself? And Jeffrey said, well, maybe that would work for you, but for me, I would mainly just care for myself, even if it was at the expense of others. And so, this is the necessity of engaging some sort of training to help our, and this is what the tradition is so great is it doesn't just say, be more kind. It gives us these recipes, assumes that you're not, and that's okay, because here's some things you can do to be a little bit different, right? So when we, train ourselves to intentionally direct our attention so as to try to help more effectively, one of the things we notice is how we're not honest with ourselves about so many things. We're not honest about the basic situation. And it's like I'm using the word honesty here to talk about what, in the tradition is called wisdom, like seeing clearly what's really there. Effective kindness requires sometimes, painful honesty about our self-deceptions. To present ourselves as we are, for better or worse, as best we're able. If we get a sense that reality as it is inconceivable, and this is what the Mahayana Sutras say, but that, we can use words and concepts to approach it and guide ourselves toward it. But the right words or the right concepts might be different for different people at different times. That's why Buddha was talking for 45 years and said so many different things to so many different people. It wasn't like there was just the word that you could say, and now everybody is okay because they heard that word. I was used to say Buddha would be a quack, right? Like a fake doctor, just say it doesn't matter what you have, arthritis, acne, cancer. Here's the snake oil. It will fix it all, right? That's not the kind of doctor that the Buddha is. So there has to be all different kinds of ways to present things to different kinds of people. And then this makes you less dogmatic, and more flexible and open and thinking about what's the right way to say things. And another thing, I think, when we're in seeking to be effectively kind, we're more honest about things. That we understand that everyone is afraid. We're afraid about our vulnerability. We're afraid of pain. We're mortal and we're anxious. Many people are in a panic or have repressed their panic about that. So we all have very clever ways to avoid looking at these things that panic us. And all of these things, like our circumstances, our vulnerabilities, our pain, and also our writhing this way and that so as to avoid facing those things, weirdly, that is one of the fundamental things that binds us together in the Sangha, in the community, is that we all have these common problems. We tend to think of my private, separate problem, but it's really like that. Our problems aren't private and separate. It's like this is the First Noble Truth is applying to everybody, and we're all struggling and working with these things, and that's a sort. His Holiness the Dalai Lama is always saying, we're all fundamentally alike in a deep way because we all want happiness and don't want suffering. But he could add, and yet we don't get what we want, and we do get what we don't want, and that's fundamentally in common too, right? So we don't want suffering, and yet we get it anyway, and that really is a deep commonality that I experience. That as the point of contact between me, and it makes me feel like I'm in a human family. Unfortunately, it's the pain family, but it's still one big family, right? Anyway, that's how I see it. Naomi Shahib Nye said, before you know kindness is the deepest thing inside, you have to know sorrow is the other deepest thing. And so when we have our turn to be afflicted and suffer loss that goes beyond what we can bear, we might blame ourselves or feel rage or despair, or we might feel that this pain that no one else actually can know is isolating us from the rest of the world. But I think this kind of honesty that I'm talking about shows us that other suffering is just as real and just as horribly painful from their own side, and also that it matters just as much, even though we would, rather not see it that way. We like to think that we're sensible, reasonable people, and but there's no objective reason actually to constantly be privileging our own welfare over that of others. It's a really strong preference that we have, to which we're genetically predisposed, karmically predisposed, culturally conditioned. All these things work together. But it seems to me that this narrow sense of self-interest is not rational, and it's actually self-defeating. It's the pretense that's led the whole planet to the brink of catastrophe. So we all have these built-in confusions, thinking that we're permanent and central to the universe, and that somehow I'm in here while everyone is out there separate. And we feel sorry for everybody else out there, but clearly my situation is quite different. It's just saying it this way, you can see that it doesn't make any sense, because when I say my, each of you is thinking of a different person than I was talking about. But also, I think honesty can show us that, like, at least for most of us, helping others, opening our heart to others, including, being able to tolerate seeing others suffering, it actually does make us happier and brings a sense of peace or satisfaction that's like unexpected, maybe, based on the assumptions we've had about how things work. We should build fences to keep other people's pain away, right? But we can commit ourselves to caring for one another, and we could do this either because we're pretty sure that there's no one else going to do it. I mean, no one else from Mars or any place. Or maybe we could do it because we think that our guru would approve, or because the Buddha would like us to act that way. And as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't make any difference. What matters is that we make a resolution or a commitment to try to not miss chances to be kind to one another. And if we do miss a chance, as we do, that we regret that and forgive ourselves and resolve to be as kind as we can the next day and the day after that. Thanks. Thank you all. How long are we doing? We're going to chant the four immeasurables, or
sure.
Okay. Do we chant the four immeasurables at 12? Should I take questions first and then? Questions first. Okay. Are there any questions? We have a few minutes.
Hello.
Somebody's talking. Oh, microphone.
Any questions?
Okay.
Hartman's got a question for you.
He doesn't? Okay.
He's got a question. Somebody has, there's a question.
Thank you for your talk this morning. My name is Brian.
Hi, Brian.
And I hear what you're saying, but my heart is not there, and I don't know how or when to get it there, and my aunt right now is in a nursing home, and she probably won't leave the nursing home. Very close to her, as well as Gelek Rimpoche in February last. And it just seems that, you get close to people, and I know the expectation is we're not going to be here, and change is it's impermanent. But it seems as time goes on, it's more difficult to work with it. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, how one does that. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, knowing that, that things are impermanent and that we're mortal, and being reminded of that in our practice makes it so that when we lose people, we may not be very surprised. And it's like just, this is confirmation of what the Buddha taught. But then it still makes us feel really bad. And really bad sometimes, right? And lost and depressed and in shock. And so I think that that's normal and part of being a human being. Like I was saying the other day, is that we're not Buddhas. We're human beings. We form attachments, and we feel pain when these attachments are broken. And it's like we should not be reproaching ourselves for the mere fact of being human beings and having this kind of suffering, not being disappointed in ourselves or in the Dharma, but looking at it as like, okay, this is really difficult waves of pain that are coming associated with these experiences, and that we can watch, to the extent that we're able, just watch these waves of suffering, rise, and then sometimes not think of them as a solid thing, not think of ourselves as the person who is suffering these terrible losses, but just actually watch how our experience changes, like day to day with that. And I think over time we can integrate, if we try to, into our sense of our relationship with other people we care about, this kind of expectation that it won't last forever, right? And that if we are able to do that, then it makes it a little less shocking, when they pass away. But I know that that's very hard. I'm talking about that topic this weekend because I wrote a book on Buddhist practice, or in relationship to the grief I experienced when my wife died in 2013. And I say in there that there's limits to what mindfulness practice can do for me in this situation. It's like how much your practice helps you when you face some kind of life catastrophe really depends on what kind of practice you had before then. And if you don't have if your mindfulness practice isn't up to the overwhelming waves of pain that are coming in, then you need to do something else, like working with loving kindness meditation, and starting with loving kindness meditation, starting with loving and caring for yourself. Wishing well for yourself. I think that's very important. If you're in depression and shock at losing somebody, thinking about how these people who love you would really wish for you to be happy, and join with them in that wish by wishing for your own welfare, for your mind to be clear and well. And anyway, I found this to be, I'll just say, this helped me personally. The stuff that I was talking about here was like hearing about other people's suffering, and in that way, opening up your heart. This was also a real experience for me, but it didn't take place for some months. At first it was all I could do to just say a mantra, because it's a natural condition, like having a concussion, right? You have to forgive yourself and just say, oh, this is what it's like to lose your mind for a while. It's natural. Okay. Shall we chant or sing? Do we sing?
We will in 1 sec. I have a quick question.
Okay.
Could you expound on the qualities of your teacher, Geshe Yeshe Tapke, a little more? Because he's so gentle and so kind. We've had him here, and we're looking forward to having him back.
Oh, I don't know. You know what it is just as well as I do. He's like, he has this sort of twinkling, mischievous, like gentle, kindness, like radiates this kind of happiness at the same time as he's limping along, and you're thinking like he must be in pain, but somehow he's like really happy. And he's very, I don't know, he's very good humored. Like the whole time that I've known him, he's never spoken English to me, and he refuses to speak English, and he claims that he doesn't speak any English. But then I met his niece, and she told me that he taught her English. And then I noticed, like when I did a kind of weekend intensive where he was teaching part of it and Jay Garfield and I were teaching the other part of it. So we were teaching side by side. And on the last day, all three of us were there together, you know, answering questions and kind of a joint session. And it's very, very clear that he understood everything I was saying. he would react to what I was saying, although he would react in Tibetan, but it was like, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. Yes.
I remember one thing about him. Hold on 1 second. Hold on. I just want to make a comment about it. The thing I remember about him. It's on. Okay. The thing I remember about him is he came and gave a talk, and he's been here pretty frequently, and he was talking about emptiness. And I've struggled with that for a long time. And he's going like this, and the translator's over here. And I thought, wow, he knows exactly what he's talking about. So I thought, okay, there's hope for me.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, he does know what he's talking about, that's for sure. Yeah. I mean, just about that in general, so there is a very useful, powerful, clear philosophy that's a set of interrelated concepts that comes down through the tradition, basically from Tsongkhapa. Tsongkhapa's way of reading the tradition that preceded him from India and going back to Buddha. But he read it in a particular way and made it super clear. It's complicated, but it's super clear and makes sense. And that comes down to us through people like Geshe Geshe Tupke who understand it and can explain it. And it is possible to understand. It's like totally, it's a little complicated, but it's not impossible. It's totally possible to understand. It does not make you enlightened, however, I can tell you that. It's like a thing, right? As the idea is that if you understand it and then you can start with this, it's like, oh, the meaning of reality is not content-free nothingness. There is a certain, idea behind it, but it's just understanding that idea is like the starting point for, deeper meditation. That goes into an experience that's beyond description, and therefore it could be described in other ways. In other words, you see my point. You could use different kinds of. You could use Zen language or Nyingma language to point to that same inconceivable experience, which is the actual antidote. Understanding emptiness is not the actual antidote to our needless suffering. We have to know it in a direct way, and that's that's another step. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
May all beings have happiness. May they be free from suffering. May they find the joy that has never known suffering. May they be free from attachment and hatred.